What if a tiny island, one you might not think about often, actually held a vital key to understanding, well, ancient European migration,
Hmm.
right there in its DNA? Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're looking into the genetic story of Malta. It's a small nation, yeah, fewer than 500,000 people live there, but its population is, it turns out, one of the most genetically distinct and archaeologically rich in the whole Mediterranean.
And right at the heart of this, you have what some researchers call the Malta gene. Now, it's not like a single specific mutation. It's more a fascinating genetic footprint, really. It connects ancient seafarers, those early Neolithic farmers, and it even tells us something about modern Mediterranean resilience.
That's really something. And it's not just digging into the ancient past, is it? This story touches on, well, current debates about isolation, identity, even how evolution works.
Hmm.
So our mission here is to, unpack Malta's genetic profile a bit. We want to explore these really surprising disconnects between their language and their DNA and talk about what it all means, this unique genetic makeup. Think of this as your shortcut to getting your head around this remarkable genetic story. So where do we even begin with such a complex history?
Well, a good starting point is Malta's geography. I mean, look where it is. It's nestled right there between Sicily and North Africa. And that position, its long-standing place on the map, has always made its genetic story a bit of, well, an enigma. For centuries, people mostly speculated about its influences.
Right, based on location, you'd assume certain connections. But what's amazing is how much a single big study in 2020 kind of blew that open, didn't it? A population genomic study.
It really did. That study analyzed Maltese genetic samples, and the insights were, frankly, incredible. It showed that Maltese people carry over 70% Neolithic Anatolian ancestry.
70%.
70%, which is astonishingly high. It's actually one of the highest levels we see in modern Europeans.
Wow, 70% Neolithic Anatolian. That's an extraordinary signature for a European population today. What does that really imply then for Malta's ancient roots?
Well, it implies something pretty profound, unexpected genetic continuity. We're seeing a clear, preserved link, a direct line between the ancient island settlers, from the Neolithic and Bronze Ages, and the people living there today.
So not much mixing later on.
Very little, relatively speaking. The studies show really low admixture from later migrations, even significant ones like the Moorish period or the Normans or the Ottomans. It suggests this incredible genetic stability that's been maintained for, well, thousands of years.
It's almost like Malta acted as a kind of living genetic archive, preserving a lineage that, in other parts of Europe got much more mixed up over time.
That's a good way to put it, a genetic archive.
It feels like a really crucial piece for understanding early European farming and settlement, one that maybe gets overlooked in the bigger historical sweep.
Absolutely, often overlooked.
But, okay, if their genes tell that story, their language seems to tell a completely different one, right? That's where it gets really fascinating.
It does. This is where the Malta story gets, truly intriguing. Despite that deep genetic line back to ancient European migrations, Malta's official language, Maltese, it's distinctly Semitic. It comes mostly from Arabic.
From Arabic, but written differently.
Exactly, written in Latin script, and it's also heavily soaked up influences from Italian and English too.
So this disconnect, language versus genes, how common is that, globally? And what does Malta teach us about how culture and biology, sometimes go down different paths?
Well, this kind of really profound language shift without a major genetic replacement, it's actually pretty rare in human history. Malta is quite an exceptional case study because of it.
So the genetics confirm the lack of connection to Arabic speakers.
Yeah, genetic comparative studies show Maltese people have quite limited Arab or Middle Eastern ancestry. We're talking maybe around 5 to 7%, something like that.
Okay, so what's the theory then? How did they end up speaking an Arabic-derived language?
The prevailing theory, the most likely explanation, is that a language shift happened, probably during the Arab rule, say between the 9th and 11th centuries. The thinking is the Maltese people adopted new linguistic tools, essentially a new language, but biologically, genetically, they stayed tied to their much older Mediterranean roots.
So the culture, the language flowed in one direction, but the genetic river, so to speak, kept to its original course.
Precisely.
That's a really powerful example of how complex history can be, how cultural spread doesn't always mean genetic spread.
It really underscores that complexity.
Okay, now, we need to touch on something that requires maybe a bit of careful handling, this idea of genetic isolation. Because Malta, due to centuries of being an island, geographically and culturally, its population has stayed relatively, well, isolated genetically.
Yes, that's true. And some studies, like the 2020 Genomics Consortium data you mentioned, report that the Maltese might have among the lowest levels of genetic diversity in Europe.
Right. And this isolation, it has different kinds of impacts, doesn't it? Particularly medically.
It does. It's multifaceted. On one hand, this relative genetic homogeneity can actually be really useful for medical research, for tracking hereditary diseases.
For example.
Well, conditions like thalassemia, which you find commonly in Mediterranean regions anyway, but also some rare cardiomyopathies, these have been traced pretty clearly to specific founder effects within Maltese communities.
Could you just quickly explain founder effects for us?
Sure. Think of it like this. Imagine a small group of people starts a new population, and they happen to carry a specific genetic trait, maybe a predisposition to a disease. If that population stays relatively isolated, that trait can become much more common in later generations just because it was there in high frequency among the founders.
Got it. So the initial genetic makeup gets kind of concentrated.
Exactly, concentrated over generations. And we also see it in things like mitochondrial DNA lineages, the ones passed down the maternal line. There are distinct lineages in Malta found almost nowhere else in Europe.
So, okay, medically useful for research. But it feels like there's a sensitivity here. How do we talk about this genetic distinctiveness without it being, twisted or misinterpreted, especially today?
That's a really crucial point, and researchers are generally very careful about this. They stress that genetic isolation absolutely does not mean superiority or purity or anything like that.
Right.
When you connect it to the wider society, yeah, there's a legitimate caution. Narratives about genetic uniqueness could potentially be misused by, say, nationalists wanting to resist immigration or promote some kind of fixed biological Maltese identity.
But that's not the scientific takeaway.
Not at all. From a scientific perspective, it just tells a different story. A unique story about how genes move through populations, or, in Malta's case, how they haven't moved quite as much as elsewhere. It's simply about a distinct pattern of gene flow, not about hierarchy or value.
That's a really important distinction to keep making. Okay, shifting slightly. Malta's location, it's always been seen as this vital bridge, hasn't it, between Europe and Africa? A sort of crossroads for trade and culture. Do the modern genetics actually support that idea of it being a literal bridge for people, for significant population mixing?
That's another interesting assumption the genetics challenge. Despite that historical perception and probably reality of it being a bridge for goods and ideas, the modern genetic studies actually show surprisingly minimal African or, as we said, Arab admixture in the Maltese DNA.
Really? So minimal impact from North Africa, too?
Relatively minimal, yeah. It really forces us to rethink those assumptions that major trade routes and conquests automatically lead to massive genetic mixing in every single location.
So if it wasn't a genetic melting pot, what was its role then? Did people just pass through, or was it something else?
Well, one idea gaining traction among scientists is that Malta functioned more as a point of cultural exchange rather than a major genetic mixing zone. It definitely absorbed languages, it absorbed religions, technologies, ideas.
But the gene pool itself stayed relatively stable.
Remarkably stable, yeah. And that's probably down to a combination of factors. It's small population size historically, and of course just being an island. Island geography naturally puts some limits on large-scale permanent movements of people settling down and mixing in.
Okay, so that makes Malta both a bridge and a bottleneck. That's an interesting way to think about it.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
A rare place where ideas, languages, culture maybe moved quite fast, but the genes themselves didn't follow quite the same rapid path.
Precisely. Ideas traveled faster than genes, you could say.
So let's bring it back then. The Malta gene, as it's sometimes called. Is it truly special?
I think it absolutely is, yeah. It's special because it captures one of the best preserved links we have in Europe back to those original Neolithic migrations. And on top of that, it presents this incredibly unusual combination of language, culture, and DNA. You don't see that mix very often anywhere in the world.
And it's crucial to stress, again, that uniqueness doesn't imply better or purer, right? It just means different. A testament to the many, many ways human history can play out.
Exactly right. It just tells its own distinct, unique story, a fascinating story of human history and adaptation on an island.
So now it's over to you, the listener, to maybe reflect on this remarkable place. Is Malta's genetic uniqueness something to, protect, to celebrate, or maybe even to question? Does that kind of isolation inevitably shape identity, or does identity find ways to evolve regardless of DNA?
Because, you know, when you look at genes and heritage, Malta really proves the past isn't just some frozen thing locked away. It's still very much alive. It's still shaping the present in really interesting ways.